significant players in the Australian resource industry. The Senate Economics Committee is continuing its job of shining a light on the taxation arrangements of some of the significant players in the Australian economy. At this point in time, the committee will be reporting on the 30th of November and will be taking into account the submissions that have been put before us today. And the inquiry will continue on this afternoon. And I'm going to hand it over to Sandy Dastyari for some further comments.
Thank you. Look, the evidence we saw today was just extraordinary, and it continues what we have seen time and time again. Let's be clear. The structures created by Chevron with its own internal loans are a rort. They've always been a rort, and they continue to be a rort, and the federal court has called them out for the rort of a structure that they've created. This is not a victimless act. Every dollar that Chevron minimises, every dollar that Chevron avoids, is a dollar that's not being spent on our schools, on our hospitals, and on the services that we all rely on. Frankly, we have spent a year trying to find Australia's biggest tax dodger, and we found them. It's Chevron.
Dastyari. It's remarkable that we are having a debate in this country about whether we can afford to pay for schools and hospitals while we've got hugely profitable multinational companies who aren't paying their fair share of tax. And today we heard from Chevron. Chevron don't seem to get it. Their argument is we're not doing anything that's outside the law. But what they don't understand is that by not paying their fair share of tax, the burden falls on the rest of the community. In fact, we're having a debate right now about the GST at the same time as companies as profitable as Chevron are not paying their fair share of tax. We heard about how when it's convenient, Chevron use as their currency the US dollar, but when it comes to minimising tax, they're more than happy to lend using the Australian dollar. What we've got is a situation where big companies are employing the best accountants in the world to avoid paying their fair share of tax. It's got to stop. What I hope comes from this Senate inquiry is some legislation that makes it much more difficult for these companies to avoid what is their responsibility, and that is to ensure that they pay their fair share of tax from the resources that they extract from the Australian community. That's fair, that's decent, and that's the job of this Senate inquiry.
So you don't believe Chevron when they say they're not doing anything illegal?
Oh, well, I think the Australian Tax Office is currently testing whether what Chevron have done is within the law or not. That is currently before them. But if they're not doing anything illegal, they're certainly doing something that's immoral. And it is immoral to raise huge profits from Australian resources and to not pay your fair share of tax. Because what it does do is it deprives the Australian community of the hospitals they need, the schools they need, of the support that we need to ensure that we as a country provide the services that the Australian community deserve.
Do we have any indication of just how many millions or indeed billions Australia is losing through companies that are doing, as you say, Chevron, are doing the correct thing but not necessarily the moral thing, if you like?
Well, perhaps I'll just say it's very difficult to quantify exactly how much is being lost in taxation revenue. It is in the billions of dollars. And the purpose of this inquiry is to try to get to the bottom of how we resolve that. What are the laws that we need to introduce? And I hope that the Senate committee will come up with some very strong recommendations around that. There is legislation before the Parliament right now. It was encouraging to hear BP suggest that they support legislated transparency provisions. The Senate is engaged in a debate about this right now, and we saw Malcolm Turnbull stand with multinational tax avoiders to avoid transparency provisions being introduced into the federal parliament. Remarkable that he would, as the Prime Minister of the country, engage in a debate around tax reform and not, as part of that, think that transparency is a critical component. One of the best ways to resolve this, and we saw today the presence of Chevron and the huge media interest that there has been in this, is to shine a spotlight in these very dark corners. We have companies who spend inordinate amounts of time and money to minimise their tax, and the best way to address the issue is with more transparency. Now, we had BP say that they support mandated transparency provisions. Well, that legislation's before the Senate right now, and it's up to Malcolm Turnbull to decide, does he stand with the multinational tax avoiders or does he stand with the Australian community? Does he think that we can't afford to pay for Medicare, for hospitals, for schools, while giving these hugely profitable companies a get-out-of-jail card? I mean, that's the question for Malcolm Turnbull right now.
I think it's extraordinary that we're having a debate about possibly increasing the GST on families. Increasing the GST on families when, frankly, the evidence we see time and time again is a handful of large multinational companies are taking Australia for a ride. The evidence is out there. It's time to act. We can act. There's legislation before the Senate. It goes part of the way. But frankly, we will come out with a final report at the end of the year, and I don't want to preempt the work of the committee, but I believe that we can and should go further.
Speaking of taking Australia for a ride, companies like Uber and Airbnb, they both are about to be heard from in this inquiry. Is it true that these two literally funnel money out of the country through Ireland and I can't remember the other?
Yeah, look, I mean, we'll give them an opportunity to provide some evidence today, and the Australian Tax Office is coming later. The worry is this. What is happening at both ends of the scale? On one hand, you've got the large established companies, your oil and gas companies, companies like Chevron, who have created what we believe, or I believe, are contrived structures to avoid their tax responsibilities in Australia. And on the other hand, making sure with these new emerging companies that we have the right tax settings and the right structures in place. The reality is the tax system that was created for a different era, and the whole idea of what is permanent and what's a permanent establishment doesn't mean what it used to. The challenge for us is to get the settings right for the big companies, but also make sure the settings are right for these new emerging companies. If they're exciting, they're innovative, they're new, companies like Airbnb and Uber are exciting companies that should be encouraged to grow, but we also have to make sure we're getting our fair share of tax and that the tax settings are right as well. That's the challenge.
Do you agree with Chevron that they're being hard done by the press and by the unions, as they claimed in their testimony?
It's hard to ask a politician whether or not they believe anyone else is being hard done by the media. I think that could come in our shoes for a little while. But, I mean, look, let's be clear here. Chevron is an incredibly profitable, incredibly successful company. I want Chevron to get rich. I want Chevron to do incredibly well. We just want to make sure they're paying their taxes at the same time. That's the challenge here. That's what we have to pursue. There's nothing wrong with Chevron being a profitable company. We just want to make sure they're paying their Australian workers properly and that they're actually paying their fair share of tax. This idea and this false choice that if we actually tax them and make them pay what they should be paying in Australia would mean that they wouldn't be profitable is false, and it shouldn't be allowed to stand.
I just want to say a few words about that, Heath. I mean, the best thing that we can do is to shine a spotlight on the activities of these companies, and that's in part the strength of this inquiry. If they feel that they're being hard done by, well, let them justify their actions. How do you justify using currency in a way that allows you to minimise tax? How do you justify reaping billions of dollars in profits and yet paying next to no tax? We heard today evidence about their shipping operations being based in Bermuda, and we had the laughable argument that Bermuda's been chosen because of its incredible safety record. A justification was used that that a number of shipping companies are based in Bermuda, and that's why Chevron are based there. Well, that's again chicken and egg. The reason those shipping companies have chosen Bermuda is because of the tax advantages. Let's have a frank debate about this. So Chevron don't like it, and many of these companies don't like having to justify their activities. It's why the legislation before the Senate is so critical, because it ensures that transparency, and it's why having the interest from the media and from the civil society sector is so critical. So we can expose some of these activities, and we can ensure that if they want to continue to have a social licence to operate in Australia, that they have to pay their fair share of tax. We can't have a government that says, on one hand, we can't afford to pay for schools and hospitals, and on the other hand, give these guys a get-out-of-jail card when it comes to paying their tax. It's not fair, The more scrutiny that's applied to many of these companies, I think what we'll see is some movement, and that's a good thing.